Hey, what's up, Liron here. In today's video, we'll paint together this beautiful railway system scene, very atmospheric, very moody, and this is actually a preparation for hopefully a larger piece that I will paint soon. So I want to show you how I do that, how I get the result in relatively quickly, but still including all the beautiful elements of the scene. So let's get to it. Okay, so I'm going to show you everything from start to finish, real time, because I really want to put a lot of emphasis on many important factors here. My goal is to do a smaller study and really convey the idea of an industrial scene. But with all of the details and everything you see in the reference photo, my idea is still a study geared towards planning my larger version of this and geared towards really simplifying a lot of the details. And this is something you'll also see in the How to Simplify course that I'll update you on soon. But you really notice how I took the entirety of the background and really simplified it into one big shape. And that's the key you want to pay attention to. Your painting should have, if you are aiming for this kind of simplification, should have about 3 to 5 or 6 major shapes. Like I'm doing here. So for me, one shape is the sky. It's easy to disregard it as a shape because it's a negative shape, but actually it is a shape. If you look at it, it is a shape of a lighter value. So one is the sky, another one is the entirety, that's Ruth, sorry if you heard it, the entirety of the background. Then we have those sheds on the left, or whatever these are, maybe a station. We have the terrain itself, the shadowy part, because the light part is basically a highlight left from the previous wash, and then all of these railways, which are probably the only thing that's really filled with details in it. So you really want to look at it in terms of fewer shapes, and what really matters is this and how many details you put within each of these shapes. I aspire in this one to put very few details in the shapes themselves, okay? Now, I'm designing the shape of the railways, kind of following what I see, but making sure that the curves make sense in perspective. Notice how squashed they are. I could have probably squeezed them a little more even. That's really responsible for it looking like we're not looking at it from above, but rather it's a scene that is in front of us, and that's something you want to pay attention to. The curves aren't wide. They're very squeezed tight together. It's very important to keep them that way. On top of these, I put on the train. One thing I want to direct your attention to is that if you do the planning right, you don't even need to have good drawing skills necessarily. You can actually get away with a very loose drawing that isn't really accurate in terms of the details, but the placement of elements is correct. So if I create a nice little background there with all of the buildings that has an interesting composition, that's enough to pass as a background. I don't actually need these big, I forgot like chimneys or whatever those are, industrial chimneys. I don't need them to be fully accurate and have them fully curved up top and get the right angle and get all of the small architectural details. I don't need all of that. The only thing I really need is an overall impression. And then the values are going to play a role in how I really develop this in terms of the depth, okay, the sense of depth here. So really treat this as a simplified kind of drawing. Don't worry if you're not experienced in drawing, if you don't have the ability necessarily to draw things accurately. It's really a minor part, believe it or not. So that wraps up the drawing stage. Next up, we can get started with painting. Now look at the sky. The sky is very light. Ideally, you could even leave it paper white, but I did want to tint it somehow. So I'm going very light there. You see, I'm putting some paint, but then I'm coming back with water, helping it move, because it is important to keep this section fairly light. This is gonna dictate the direction for the rest of the painting. So I really want to make sure that I don't go too dark and kill off possible highlights. My strategy here is kind of what I always do. I start with a bit of a cool color for the sky, and then I add a bit of warmth to it, or maybe I'll go the other way around. I'll start warm and then put wet in wet some blue. The thing is, a lot of people are worried about these blues and yellow mixing in together. You don't have to. In fact, it's even better if they do mix to some extent. That's what keeps your painting organic. If you're using pure blues, pure yellows, pure reds, the painting will look very amateurish in a way. And the reason for that is because
everything we see around us is so influenced by the atmosphere, by the weather, by the amount of fog and mist and sunlight and its direction. And like this kind of a thing is a bit against the light. So it really influences everything, which makes it very rare to see a pure blue or pure yellow. That's just something that is not going to happen. So by letting all of your colors mix together to some extent, you're allowing the painting to have a more organic and realistic feel to it, which is why it doesn't really matter to, for me at least, to match the color I see. What's more important for me, and you could say also match the color and match the gray, but for me it's more about the overall feeling of it. And I know the values are going to play that important role that I'm after to get the realistic impression. So just something to have in mind. As we paint this, now I'm doing some wet and wet. Missed some red in the scene, so I kind of put it on the train. Wasn't a must. Nothing here really is a must. I'm kind of painting things the way I want to. But I did skip that top part of the train. I did not paint over it with a yellow or with a light color at all. The reason for that is I do want it to really pop. I could have covered it with a very thin coat of yellow. I could have, and it would probably have looked right. But I really wanted this part to pop, so I'm keeping it fairly light. Now, I did promise I'll show you more of the sheen, so here's where we're at. The paint near the sheds there on the left, or the stations, is really wet. So you see now, I give it a few minutes, now it's a little drier. Look at the chimneys in the right, top right section. That's especially where I want you to focus, because that's where I'm going to put some wet and wet. Okay, so it's still a little wet, and I'm putting some of these details wet and wet. If you look at a reference photo, this is where things get very light and kind of foggy and misty and atmospheric. So why not place these in now while it's still wet so that we'll get softer edges? So 2 important points here. You saw the sheen, and you can rewind the video a bit, and you will see it's wet, but it's not like really wet and flowy, which is what will allow these shapes to stay and not to blend out completely. If you put a very wet wash and then immediately go in wet and wet, everything's going to move all over the place. This is not the case here. Okay, you see it's pretty contained. Look at how wet it is. You saw that? It's wet, but not fully wet and flowing. That's very important, because that's the right timing you're after. And again, rewind it if you want to see exactly what the sheen looks like. And in addition to that, I'm also using very thick paint, because the paint has to battle against the wetness already on paper. Okay, now notice how I just did it for the right section. Why? Because the left section feels a little stronger. I could have done it for the entirety of the background. That's a possibility. I decided to do it on part of it so that I send some of it back. So what we're going to end up with is a left section that's a little more clear, a little bit sharper and in focus, and the right section is going to kind of flow into the background. Now with that, I do want to keep the left section fairly light, because it's still something that is in the background. Now my colors here, I'm actually not following the advice I gave you, are a little too saturated even. And I don't mind that, but as long as it was intentional, because very often I'll do it intentionally. Here I didn't really, so if you look at the color of these buildings on the reference photo, it's much grayer, okay? It's much more muted. Whereas mine is a little more orange, a bit of a stronger orange. That's fine, not the end of the world. Again, the values mean more to me. Now, what is important, remember we talked about shapes. We talked about fewer shapes. We talked about really minimizing those shapes. The one thing that is important when you're simplifying by shapes is the outline of the shapes. So what I'm doing is taking every chance I get to add some details to the outline. And I really do treat these cranes as part of the outline. If you follow the line around the shape, I don't want it to just be a straight line or a curved line. I want there to be some details there. One of those details is these cranes and their rigging and their wires and their weights and everything. Then I move on to the next chimney, and I continue, and you see I'm putting in those jagged edges. Not all of them, not even many of them, but some of them. That shape's outline is going to define what we're looking at. Because we don't have all of the details within it, and because we don't have a separation between the different details of the background. Again, I paint it as one big shape. So where do we make these distinctions? In the outlines of the shapes. And that's really smart. That's something you really want to pay attention to. And I'm gonna draw a parallel to sketching and drawing. When you want to convey, for example, an animal's texture, like a dog's fur, you very rarely need to paint each and every hair. What you will often do is indicate a few hairs, but most of the texture will be expressed by the outline. You will put in a few jagged lines in the outline, hinting that this is a furry texture. And that's the thing you want to pay attention to. So all of these cranes, and you don't want to go too overboard with them, obviously, because they're quite in the background. But these cranes are important to tell the viewer this is an industrial area, or maybe this is next to a port, or next to a factory, or next to whatever, okay? Some kind of a transportation center. It could be many things. But this is one of the hints we give to the viewer. Now look at what happens here. I get to the area that's blended. So what I'm gonna do is kind of stop my wash here. And, sorry, the way I'm gonna stop it is probably by softly blending it into what's already there. But it is important to remember there are some cranes there, so I do want to put more of these details in. And remember, because this is such a loose piece and very impressionistic, these cranes are pretty much the only major detail. So I want to make sure that I am putting a bit of it there. And now we're blending that edge right into the previous part drawn wet and wet. Okay. There is a bit more of a wash to continue there, so I'm going to put in those lower sections. And this brings us to some of the more complex parts of this wash, where we really have to start paying attention to the shapes and the highlights and everything. Because as we move down in the painting, we're moving away from these very loose silhouettes of buildings, essentially, which is just one big shape of a silhouette of a building. We're moving away from that and towards some shapes in which it is important to leave some highlights on the rooftops. Obviously, all of these railways on the right, all of the rails are expressed by highlights, so we really want to pay attention to that. I'll do it negative painting, but you could add them later on with opaque paint because there's just so much of them that I think it is justified if you want to use a bit of a different technique. For me personally, I'd much rather, whenever possible, to render things based on my brush skills and technique, aka paint around them, rather than rely on opaque paint. I am not scared to rely on opaque paint. I'm not ashamed to use it, but I prefer the pureness of avoiding it if possible. Now, as for these stations on the left, starting to put them in, they reach all the way to where some of the rails start, but I am keeping this small gap mainly on the right side, okay? A bit on the left too, mainly on the right side because that's really where the sunlight hits those rooftops. This scene, it's just beautiful. There's so much interest going on, so many interesting details to pay attention to. One of the things as I'm looking at this process again after the fact and in retrospect, one of the things that could improve it is actually if I had gone a little lighter on the background. Funny enough, I went a little too dark on some sections there, especially on the left. And these do have an influence on the overall impression. Sometimes you can't put your finger on the thing that's bugging you, but it's actually there and it influences your perception of the painting. But in any case, now I'm starting to indicate those railways. By the way, should have started a little lighter and move on to dark as they get closer to us. So that's another kind of lesson learned. And remember, the entire reason why I'm doing this is to learn those lessons, is to understand the scene better and to be able to tackle it better when I paint it in a larger size. So it's actually job done, job well done. Okay, and it's just a part of it. You know, the process of studying involves getting the results you don't want to, and getting failure, if you will. So that's really important. Now I'm starting to create the shape for the body of the train. This is pretty straightforward. It's just one big shadow on the right section. There are some highlights that I will go on and miss at this stage and bring them back later on with some opaque paint. Now we'll look at the shadow under the train. This is incredibly important because that shadow is what defines it as a train. It is what ties it to the rails. It is what connects it to the ground. So this one is really important, and I'm making sure to draw it in a way that is convincing as much as I can. The gaps between the different train carts, very important. And you see how we're slowly becoming more familiar with the scene, the things we have to look out for. One big thing I'll notice is the entire construction of the rails and how they do start a little lighter and then they become darker gradually as they come towards us. One more thing I want to pay attention to is the nuances in the train's body. The temperature as well could be a little cooler, actually. All of these things, again, when you paint again the same scene again and again, I'm saying again a lot, but when you do that, you learn so many new things that even if you don't remember them, the next time you'll tackle them in the painting process, you will kind of like muscle memory, you will remember them. You will realize quickly, oh, this is where I did this mistake, so now I'm going to fix it. Now, a big part of this painting's beauty is layering dark and sharp over light and kind of muted and blended. So the buildings in the background and how we're going to layer them with those signs on the right, with the details on the train, with those power lines to the left or whatever, street light, even though it's not a street, it's just lights, light posts or lamps. The way we layer these things is what will create this sense of depth, okay? Because the train right now is pretty much limited to the lower section. The station on the left is kind of going above, but not really. So you see these details I'm putting in right now, these lines. They're very important. They're going to tie our foreground with our background, glaze a glazed layer above it in a way that will give a sense of depth, hopefully. Again, the background could have been a little lighter. That's my bad. And that would have created a slightly more accurate and realistic impression. But I do want you to remember that the devil's in the details. Creating a painting that looks good isn't really about getting one or two things correctly. It's about, 10 factors that are all important. Here's another example of layering dark in front of light. So you really want to remember that it's tons of factors together. We have an accurate drawing and accurate shapes, a correct simplification of them to get the impression you want. We have the overall composition, where you place everything. We have the values, we have the colors, we have the temperature. All of these small factors come together to create a painting that is convincing. We have how many highlights you place and where you place them. We have the overall balance of the painting. When you take a few steps back, does it look good? Does it feel like one painting? Or you could cut it in the middle and have a bunch of paintings that are unrelated. All of these factors together dictate how good the painting is. Is your brush technique on point, or are you constantly painting over shapes you shouldn't have? Did you get the timing of the wet and wet right? So looking at all of these factors, it may sound a little frustrating even. Like, how am I supposed to get all of these things right? The answer is you don't. The answer is you practice and practice and practice. You paint the same scene over and over. You paint different scenes over and over again until it clicks, until you suddenly realize, oh, this is a mistake I'm making. I'm pushing my values to be too dark too often. Then you realize, oh, this is a common mistake I do. I never am able to tell what's warm and what's cool. So I end up putting a lot of warm colors in the background, and then it isn't pushed back as much as I want to. I make the mistake of constantly using, for example, that's not me personally, I actually don't have that mistake, but many people do, using too many pure colors. And that creates sort of an artificial look to the painting that is really doesn't feel natural and organic. All of these things I'm mentioning, all of them together, are responsible for the painting to look good. So the odds of getting them all correctly are so low that it's fine. You don't have to worry about it. You just paint. You paint and paint and paint. And then you find your weaknesses and you practice those. You take some time, you learn, you find out that your values are totally off. So you take a break, a week or two, and you work just on that. You do tons of color matching values. First, exercises. First, you match just a value you see somewhere. Then you choose like a small section of a painting, in this example like the train, you try to match the values in this very small contained space. Then you move on to some black and white studies of full scenes. You build it up. And then when you come and paint the next painting, it still won't be perfect, but it will be better. And that's the key. And that's what you want to constantly practice and do more and more of. Okay? So a bit of a side tangent there, but I do think it's important to reiterate these concepts. And yeah, that's just important for me to say. So what you see me now doing is adding all of the details. I added a clearer separation between the train's different parts, different, what do you call it? Not crates. Crates? I forgot the word. So that I added the windows. I added some signs and some other just random stuff. Now I'm adding the white highlights. So look at what I'm doing here. I'm putting a white dot and then I'm pulling it to indicate that the train is moving. That's something that I really like doing when I'm painting cars on a highway or just on a street. That I find that this effect looks really good. Now I'm bringing in those very subtle highlights on the side of the train, which actually aren't really highlights. They aren't as light as you'd think. Okay, we have a tendency to exaggerate. That's kind of a bias. It's very easy to do, and that happens to me all the time. I exaggerate the darks, I exaggerate the lights, and this is just another iteration of it, but that's fine. And when you look at this scene, it's so complex, it's so filled with details that you have to forgive yourself in a way because it's very hard to get everything right. Like look at the shed on the right or the station on the right, you can see through it and then you can see all of the details within it. The odds of you getting all of these things right are slim at the first try. You know, give it a few tries. Don't worry about it. If you want to keep things interesting, maybe do one try in monochromatic, not even black and white. Go with a sepia, whatever you want. And then another try with colors, and then another try, maybe just focus on one element. Keep it interesting, make it interesting for yourself, in a way, okay? So a few highlights here and there. We're almost done. We're really close to finishing this. Just a few touches, and I'll sign it. I'll show you the tape removal. I'll show you everything. There is this gap between the train and the shadow that is very thin, and you'll often see this with cars also in the street. It's very easy to miss, and I often miss it too, but I wanted to really get it this time to show that there is some gap between the train itself and the rails. Put a few highlights on top of these different objects. I'm not sure what these are. Maybe like some kind of a thing to block, or I don't know, to mark a spot. I'm really not sure, but notice how beautiful it is when this object that's very dark and the shadow of the train that's very dark intersect, and you get this highlight separating the two, which is something I really like achieving. Now you will see the stray highlight here and there on top of the lamps, the lampposts. There are the gaps between the buildings that some of them I missed, so I wanted to put those back in. All sorts of subtle details. And what I want to challenge you to do is, if you're wondering whether you're overworking the piece or not, take a few steps back and ask yourself, is this enough? Am I good? Take a 20-minute break. Then come back, revisit the painting, look at it from afar, and ask yourself, does it read well? Do I feel like something is missing? Do I need more details? If the answer is yes, go ahead and add those details. But if the answer is no, you don't have to. You really don't. That's how I do it. And if you take a few steps back, you will see that this really connected nicely, and I really like the way it looks. Even if from up close, it's a little messy and it's a little more impressionistic. But again, this is a study for a larger piece that I hope to share with you in the future.
So thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed seeing the process, seeing some of the things I did struggle with, but for the most part, I think I got a good impression of the scene initially, and that way I was able to get it on paper. One of the things is you really want to pay attention to the types of scenes that you really enjoy looking at, and you really enjoy, you would think to yourself, I wish I was there and I could actually see this view in real life. That's a very good indicator to a scene you will enjoy painting, and maybe you got a good grasp of it. And don't worry if it doesn't turn out the way you want to. Obviously, it's a process. There's a reason why I do this prep painting, because I want to further develop it into a large piece, and I learned a lot from doing this kind of thing. So with that, thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn how to paint like me, how to let go with watercolor, enjoy the process, let them do what they do best, be sure to check out, as always, the link in the description box below to my frustration-free watercolor course. I think you'll find it very helpful. The feedback so far has been really, really good. And with that, we'll wrap it up, and I will see you again real soon.